The young waitress stood silently behind the counter, her fingers trembling as she traced the edge of an old business card. It had been left behind by a limping stranger just 2 nights earlier. Every evening at Maple and Pine Diner, Clara Matthews served plates and poured coffee with a smile she no longer felt. No one knew she still wore her father's dog tag under her uniform, her only keepsake after the wildfire that had taken everything. She had spent 5 years rebuilding in silence, never asking for help, never expecting anything in return, until that stormy night when an older man walked in, wet, tired, and clutching a worn briefcase. And without knowing it, he opened a door Clara had long sealed shut. Clara Matthews had grown used to being overlooked. At 31, she had mastered the art of moving through life quietly, always present, always helpful, but rarely truly seen. Each night at the Maple and Pine Diner in a sleepy upstate New York town, she wore the same pressed green uniform, her name stitched neatly above her heart. Few noticed the tiny silver chain that peeked out from beneath her collar, but she always felt its weight. It was her father's dog tag, worn thin from time and touch. She had carried it through years of hardship like a compass, guiding her through every shift, every setback, every heartbreak. Her father's Staff Sergeant James Matthews had passed when she was just 25. The fire that took their home only a year later had nearly taken her spirit too. But Clara didn't crumble. She didn't lash out or ask for sympathy. She got up, tied her apron, and went back to work. Maple and Pine wasn't much, just a faded red diner tucked between a gas station and an aging laundromat, but it was steady. Clara had worked the night shift for 5 years straight, 6 days a week. Locals called her dependable. Her boss called her replaceable. She called it survival. Most of her customers came and went without remembering her name. Truckers, shift workers, traveling salesmen, faces blurred together over coffee and scrambled eggs. She served them all the same way, calm, kind, efficient. But even efficiency couldn't stretch her paycheck far enough. Rent on her studio apartment downtown was due in 5 days. The envelope on her kitchen counter held just over half of what she needed. Still, she came in that Tuesday night like always, lip balm, bobby pins, and a quiet resolve. Rain had started to fall just after 8 unsure p.m., soft at first, then in sheets that made the diner windows blur. A cold wind cut through the parking lot. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights and the clink of utensils were the only sounds. It was a slow night. Clara refilled ketchup bottles and wiped down booze, her steps light and practiced. At 8:42, the bell above the door rang. She looked up out of habit and paused. A man stepped inside, hunched slightly, shaking off the rain. He looked to be in his late 60s, maybe older. His coat was soaked through his gray hair plastered to his forehead. One hand gripped a cane, the other clutched an old leather briefcase, like it was all he had left in the world. He walked with a heavy limp, dragging his right leg with effort. Clara approached without hesitation. "Evening," she said gently, offering a menu. "Can I get you something hot to drink?" The man hesitated. His eyes flicked to the prices. "Just coffee," he mumbled. "Black, please." She noticed the way his fingers trembled, not from age but from hunger. She'd seen that look before. Too often. Too recently. "Kitchen made a mistake earlier," she said, glancing back toward the prep line. "We've got an extra plate of tonight's special. Shepherd's pie, still warm. Want me to bring it so it doesn't go to waste?" He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. His jaw tightened. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara returned with the plate and a steaming cup of coffee. She didn't say anything else. She just smiled. And the man, who had barely looked anyone in the eye when he walked in, finally met her gaze. There was something tired in his expression, but also something grateful. Something like hope. She walked away before her boss could see. But of course, she wasn't quick enough. Roy Fenwick, the diner's manager, had been watching from the office window behind the counter. He burst through the swinging door just as the man picked up his fork. "What is this?" Matthews Roy barked. "We're not running a soup kitchen," Clara stood her ground. "I said it was a kitchen mistake," she replied calmly. Roy pointed a thick finger at her. "That comes out of your check." The man tried to protest, to push the plate away, but Clara gently set her hand on the edge of the table. "Please eat," she said quietly, never taking her eyes off Roy. He sneered. "Try this again and you're done. I don't care how long you've worked here." Then he stormed back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The man took a small bite. Clara busied herself with cleaning the coffee station, heart pounding. Her face burned not from fear but shame, not for herself but for what had just unfolded in front of someone who hadn't asked for anything but warmth. As she reached for the sugar packets, she touched the chain at her neck and whispered silently, "Still standing, Dad." She'd lived through worse, and something in her gut told her this night wasn't over yet. By the time Clara clocked out that night, the rain had slowed to a light mist, but the chill had sunk deep into her bones. She walked home with her coat zipped to her chin and her thoughts tangled like the steam rising from sewer grates. The image of the older man lingered in her mind, how he'd clutched that leather briefcase like it held his whole life, how he'd eaten slowly carefully, like he didn't know when his next meal would come. But it wasn't just his hunger that stayed with her. It was the way he had looked at her grateful yes, but something else, like he recognized her or saw something familiar in her silence. It had been years since someone had looked at Clara like that. When she reached her apartment, the heat hadn't kicked on. The building was old and temperamental. She pulled off her wet socks, sat on the edge of her bed, and opened the envelope marked rent. $412. That's all she had saved after Bill's groceries and her father's modest memorial fund. She needed $700 by Friday. The math didn't lie. She looked down at her lap. Her hands were still shaking. Not from the cold, from everything. The next morning, Clara arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, as she always did. The air smelled of burned bacon and bleach. She tightened her apron, tied her hair back, and tried to push the night before out of her mind. Roy apparently hadn't forgotten. "Matthews," he barked from behind the counter. "You're in Section 3 now." Clara blinked. Section 3 was the slowest in the diner, 2 booths by the restrooms and a corner table with a wobbly leg. Tips from that section were a third of what she usually made. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Oh, and your shifts just got cut," he added with a smirk. "We're overstaffed this week." Clara didn't respond. She just nodded, picked up her notepad, and walked away. Carl Roy's nephew and self-appointed assistant manager snickered from behind the soda machine. "Better watch out," he called loud enough for everyone to hear. "Keep giving away free food and we'll have every homeless guy in the county lining up." Maggie, the hostess, who usually joked with Clara during lulls, suddenly found her clipboard fascinating. She didn't even make eye contact. Clara felt the chill all over again, but this time it wasn't from the weather. It was isolation, the kind that seeps in when your kindness becomes a target. Even the kitchen crew, who used to slip her an extra roll or side of fries for her break, now handed her the smallest plates with a quick glance toward Roy's office window. Fear was contagious, and Roy had made Clara the example. During her 15-minute break, Clara sat alone in the staff room, legs curled beneath her. She pulled out her phone and opened the calculator app, plugging in her new hours, subtracting bus fare, groceries, and that unpaid dental bill she'd been ignoring. The numbers added up to one thing: she wasn't going to make it. She hadn't asked for a miracle. She hadn't even asked for a thank you. She just couldn't stand to see a man that hungry walk out into the rain. That afternoon, during a lull in customers, she was carrying a tray of glasses back to the dishwasher when her foot slipped slightly on a damp spot. She caught herself, but the tray tilted just enough for one glass to fall. It shattered loudly on the tile. Roy was on it in seconds. Guess what he said in front of 3 customers at the bar? "That's coming out of your paycheck, too." Clara knelt to pick up the shards, her hands trembling. "It was an accident." "Accidents cost money," Roy snapped. "Maybe think about that next time you hand out my inventory like candy." She felt her face burn, not from embarrassment, but from injustice. She had given so much to this place. Covered for co-workers, worked double shifts, never once called in sick. She had swallowed every insult, every humiliation. But this glass on the floor felt like the final crack in her dignity. That night, after the last customer left, Roy disappeared into his office without a word. Clara locked the front door, mopped the floor, wiped down every booth in silence. When she reached the booth where the limping man had sat, she paused. There, resting near the edge of the table, was something small and rectangular, a business card. She picked it up slowly. "Jonathan Pierce, Esquire, Veteran Advocacy and Labor Rights, Albany, NY." Clara stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into her pocket. It was worn at the corners, soft from years of handling. She didn't know why he'd left it. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was a thank you. Or maybe he had left it for a reason. Clara didn't believe in signs, not really. But she did believe in people, even ones who limped in from the rain and left behind unexpected hope. The next morning, Maple and Pine Diner woke to a cold sun, its light pale and filtered through leftover clouds from the storm. Clara arrived early as always, but something was different. A sleek black sedan was parked awkwardly across two spots in the gravel lot, far too polished for this side of town. It wasn't the kind of car you saw parked next to rusted pickups and aging station wagons. Clara hesitated for a moment before stepping through the diner's glass door. Inside, everything looked the same red vinyl booths, the same smell of burnt coffee, the same flickering light above the pastry case. But sitting at the counter, sipping from one of the chipped mugs, was the limping man. He was dry now, clean-shaven, dressed in a wool coat and pressed slacks. His hair was combed and he no longer clutched his briefcase like a lifeline. He looked like a man who remembered who he was, but he wasn't alone. Next to him sat a woman in her 50s, tall and composed. She wore a tailored navy blazer, and everything about her, from the crisp fold of her collar to the pen clipped neatly in her pocket, spoke of authority. She looked out of place in the humble diner, yet somehow entirely at ease. Clara froze for just a second. The woman turned and met her eyes. "Miss Matthews," the woman asked, rising from the stool. Clara nodded slowly, her hands tightening around the strap of her apron. The limping man stood too, reaching out his hand. "I don't believe I properly introduced myself the other night," he said, his voice calm but clear. "Jonathan Pierce." Clara shook his hand hesitantly. I got your card." "I hoped you would," he replied with a soft smile. Before Clara could respond, Roy burst out from the back, clearly caught off guard by the scene unfolding at his counter. "You can't just barge in," and he started, but the woman raised a single hand, silencing him. "Mr. Roy Fenwick?" she asked. Roy blinked. "Yes, my name is Eleanor Blake. I'm with the New York State Bar's Division of Labor Ethics. And from what I've gathered, your treatment of your employees is in direct violation of several state labor statutes." The entire diner went still. Even Carl Mid-Latte froze with his cup halfway to his lips. Clara stood in stunned silence. Her ears rang. Jonathan stepped forward, pulling a folder from his briefcase and placing it gently on the counter. 15 years ago, he began, his voice now carrying across the entire diner. "I was a partner at a firm that specialized in veterans' rights. After a car accident took away my mobility and career, I spent years trying to find meaning again. That search brought me here." He paused and pulled something else from the folder, an old, slightly crumpled photograph. He slid it across the counter to Clara. She stared down at it. A younger Jonathan in military dress stood beside a teenage girl and a man in fatigues, her father. The wildfire. The evacuation team. She remembered now. She remembered the trucks, the smoke, the man who had carried her father's medical records and promised they'd be safe. "That was you," she whispered. "I never forgot that moment," Jonathan said. "Your father spoke of your resilience. You were what, 16, 17, she whispered. "When I saw your name tag and then watched you give away your meal to someone like me, even while knowing it might cost you everything, I knew I'd found someone I once helped, and someone who needed help now." Roy stammered from behind the counter, trying to form words, but it was Eleanor who spoke next. Calmly, coldly. "We've already documented several potential violations, unlawful paycheck deductions, retaliatory shift changes, and threatening behavior. If confirmed, those could carry heavy penalties, including the revocation of your business license." Carl stood up from the side booth, phone in hand. "I recorded everything yesterday," he said, his voice quieter now. "The stuff about deducting the glass from her paycheck. I've got screenshots of her hours getting slashed too." Roy turned on him. "You little, I'm not going down with you," Carl muttered, backing away. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "I may be retired, Miss Matthews, but I still remember how to defend the ones who deserve it." Clara stared at the photograph again, her hand resting on her father's dog tag. The past and the present overlapped in her mind like film negatives lining up into focus. She hadn't asked for this. She had only tried to do the right thing. But now something much bigger than her was unfolding. And it all started with a warm plate of shepherd's pie and a little quiet dignity. By midday, the Maple and Pine Diner was busier than it had been in years, but no one was there for pancakes. Word had spread quickly. Some customers came out of curiosity. Others came because they'd heard something was finally happening, something just and long overdue. Clara stood behind the counter, not taking orders, not filling coffee cups, but simply standing as Jonathan Pierce and Eleanor Blake laid open folders of evidence on a table in full view of the diner's staff and patrons. Roy Fenwick had retreated to his office, blinds drawn, barking into his cell phone in whispers and pacing like a cornered animal. But even through the slats, everyone could see the sweat building on his brow. "I've worked here 3 years, Maggie," the hostess finally said, voice trembling. She was speaking to one of the young legal assistants who had arrived from Albany to help document testimonies. "Clara trained me on my first day. She's the reason I learned how to work the register. Even let me borrow gas money when I couldn't get home." "Did you witness any unfair treatment from management?" the assistant asked gently. Maggie hesitated only a second. Then she nodded. "She covered every shift I missed when my daughter was sick. She never complained, not even when Roy cut her health benefits last winter." The legal assistant made a note. A few booths down, a heavy-set truck driver who came in every Thursday morning pushed himself to his feet. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled out a $20 bill, walked to the counter, and placed it in a tip jar Clara had never seen before. Someone had hastily taped a note to the front. Clara's fund one by one, others followed. A mother with 2 toddlers, an elderly man with a cane, a teenage boy with headphones. People who had barely spoken to Clara over the years now stood in line to contribute something, anything. A second jar was added when the first filled, then a third. "For 5 years you've served me breakfast," an older woman said, tears in her eyes. "After my husband died, you were the only one who remembered how I take my tea. You think we didn't notice you?" "We noticed." Clara's hands trembled as she looked around. The very walls of the diner seemed different now, not just aged wood and greasy windows, but a place pulsing with a strange, new energy justice. Even the kitchen staff came out one by one. Carlos, who rarely spoke more than a few words in English, took off his apron and approached Eleanor. "Roy, he take money from our paychecks," he said, his voice low but clear. "Say if we complain we lose job. Or worse, he say he call immigration." Eleanor's face turned stone cold. "That's called wage theft and coercion," she replied. "And it's a felony." By 1:30 p.m., the diner resembled more of a courtroom than a greasy spoon. Customers had become witnesses. Employees had become plaintiffs. Clara stood in the eye of the storm, quiet, wide-eyed, unsure whether she was dreaming or drowning. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take any more, the bell over the door rang again. A tall man in army dress uniform stepped inside. The chatter stopped instantly. "Sarah," he called, scanning the room. Clara turned. It was her brother Jason. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. His face was leaner now, more defined by sun and service, but the same boyish grin cracked through when their eyes met. Without hesitation, she ran to him, and they embraced as the diner erupted in applause. "Jonathan tracked me down," Jason said, pulling back. "Why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" Clara tried to respond, but emotion caught in her throat. "I didn't want to worry you," she managed. "You were deployed. I figured I'd figure it out." "You don't have to anymore," he said gently. Jonathan stepped forward beside Eleanor. "Miss Matthews, we've tallied 47 documented violations of labor law in this establishment. That number may rise." Clara blinked. "We're prepared to file a class action lawsuit," Eleanor added. "But we've also spoken to the property owner." "Wait," Clara said. The owner, Roy, finally stepped out of his office, then shoulders slumped, eyes bloodshot. 2 attorneys flanked him. "We've reached a settlement," Eleanor said crisply. "Mr. Fenwick has agreed to sell his business interest in exchange for leniency and to avoid criminal prosecution." Clara looked confused, to who Jonathan smiled. "With the settlement we're filing, you could take over the lease if you want it." Clara shook her head slowly. "I'm not a business owner," she said. "I'm just a waitress." A dozen voices from around the diner responded at once. "You're much more than that." And for the first time in years, Clara believed them. Clara sat at the counter long after the last customer left that afternoon, her apron still dusted with flour, her name tag slightly askew. The hum of the old refrigerator was the only sound in the room now, and it filled the silence like an old companion refusing to leave. She held the keys in her hand, cold metallic reel. They felt heavier than she'd expected. Earlier that day, under the watchful eyes of attorneys and witnesses, Roy Fenwick had signed the final papers. He'd avoided jail time, but not shame. The moment he handed the folder to Eleanor and walked out the back door, no one followed. His time at Maple and Pine had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, necessary ending. Now it was Clara's diner. She hadn't asked for it. She never would have. But something in her gut told her this was more than justice. It was restoration. On the desk in the office, her office now, was a small wooden nameplate Roy had always kept there. Manager. She looked at it for a long time, then gently moved it aside. In its place, she set a handwritten card, simple and unassuming, "Everyone welcome." She stepped out into the dining area and was startled to find someone still there. A little girl no more than 6 stood near her usual booth, a folded piece of paper cradled in her hands. Her parents stood nearby, watching gently. The girl walked up, placed the paper on the counter next to Clara's coffee cup, and whispered, "My mommy says you're a hero." Then she scampered off without waiting for a response. Clara opened the paper. Inside was a carefully folded origami crane made from a placemat. The corners were smudged with syrup and crayon, but it was perfect in the way only something made with innocent hands could be. She closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed not by the attention, but by the emotion of finally being seen. The next few days moved like a dream. Jonathan Pierce stayed in town longer than he planned, helping Clara navigate the early steps of ownership. Eleanor connected her with a pro bono legal team that specialized in business transitions and employee rights. Several of the former staff members, once too afraid to speak up, now returned, offering their time, their support, and their loyalty. The old diner changed quickly, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The lights seemed warmer. The music played softer. Laughter lingered longer. A new community board was mounted near the entrance where neighbors could post needs and offerings, a ride to the hospital, leftover winter coats, tutoring help. A small bookshelf appeared under the windows, filled with donated paperbacks. One booth near the back was unofficially named the Veterans Table, where no one ever sat alone. And Clara. She didn't stop being a waitress. She still wore her apron, still poured coffee, still wiped down tables like she always had. But now something inside her had shifted. She stood taller, spoke more, listened deeper. People noticed. And maybe that was the point all along. Sometimes it isn't a grand gesture that turns a life around, but a moment of courage in the middle of a storm. A plate of hot food, a refusal to look away, a decision to stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. That rainy night had changed everything. Not because Clara had expected it to, but because she hadn't. She had acted out of instinct, out of decency, out of memory. And in doing so, she had reminded an entire town what quiet dignity looks like. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the neon sign flickered on for the night shift, Clara stood by the door watching families shuffle in. She touched the dog tag at her neck, her father's, and smiled. Still standing? Dad. Still standing. In today's fast-moving world, where it often feels like kindness has been replaced by convenience and decency has become optional, Clara's story reminds us of something powerful. It doesn't take fame, money, or status to make an impact. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the quiet ones, choosing compassion over indifference, dignity over pride, and fairness over fear. For many older Americans watching this, you may have lived through hard times, worked under difficult bosses, been overlooked despite your loyalty, or helped others without ever asking for anything in return. Clara represents that generation of strength. She reminds us that character still matters, that kindness still counts, and that standing up, no matter your position, can shift the course of an entire community. This story also opens a conversation for all of us. What would you have done in Clara's place? Have you ever stood alone and found unexpected support, or witnessed someone quietly change the world with a simple act? Share your story in the comments below. We read them, we learn from them, and we believe others will too. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone special, please give it a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing meaningful stories like this to life. Because sometimes the smallest gestures leave the biggest footprints. In stories like Clara's, they don't just warm the heart, they remind us what it means to be human.